Within a fraction of a second, a reaction occurs in the body. A potential adverse event begins to emerge, often well before it is quantified. In pharmacovigilance, an adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient administered a medicinal product, regardless of whether a causal relationship to the treatment is suspected. Safety teams must capture these events from clinical trials and post-marketing surveillance to identify emerging signals and manage public health risks. This process faces a significant hurdle. Raw clinical observations are inherently subjective, varying wildly across different trial sites, languages, and cultural contexts. Without a structured method of evaluation, this volume of raw safety data becomes unanalyzable noise, stripping the information of its clinical utility. In the absence of a standardized scale for clinical intensity, data aggregated from global trials becomes statistically unreliable, which can leave severe drug risks undetected. Establishing data integrity begins by addressing a pervasive operational error found throughout the industry. Professionals frequently conflate the distinct concepts of severity and seriousness. Interchanging these variables corrupts the risk-benefit evaluation pipeline and leads to flawed safety conclusions. Accurate safety science requires that the physical intensity of a symptom be assessed independently from its regulatory outcome. Failing to maintain this distinction triggers false regulatory alarms while obscuring quiet escalating clinical fronts. To maintain clarity, we can map these two metrics on a coordinate plane, creating a binary model for medical reviewers. The x-axis measures severity, the physical intensity of a specific symptom as experienced by the patient at a specific moment. The y-axis tracks seriousness, a binary regulatory classification defined by strict ICH E2A guidelines. An event is serious only if it meets specific regulatory criteria: death, a life-threatening incident, hospitalization, persistent disability, or a congenital anomaly. A severe headache that resolves with over-the-counter medication plots far to the right for high intensity, but remains at the bottom of the grid as it is non-serious. In contrast, a mild stroke has low clinical severity, but moves to the top of the y-axis because the diagnosis itself meets the regulatory threshold for seriousness. The y-axis dictates the regulatory response, mandating expedited 15-day reporting to agencies like the EMA or FDA for serious events. Data on the x-axis informs long-term safety profiling and determines the information included on product labels. Clinical intensity provides a medical warning, but a regulatory emergency depends entirely on the legally defined outcome. To measure the clinical intensity axis objectively, we must move beyond a patient's subjective description of pain. The industry standard for this task is the Common Terminology Criteria for Adverse Events, or CTCCA, version 6.0. Developed by the National Cancer Institute, CTCCA provides a comprehensive dictionary of clinical observations that are fully aligned with MedDRA terms. This system acts as a translation engine, converting a clinician's subjective observation into a globally recognized integer. The CTCCA grading scale uses a 5-tier vertical structure, organized by system organ class categories. Grade 1 is defined as asymptomatic or mild symptoms. These require diagnostic observations only and no medical intervention. Grade 2 represents moderate events.
These require minimal intervention and limit instrumental activities of daily living, such as managing finances or preparing meals. Grade 3 is severe or medically significant, requiring hospitalization and limiting self-care activities, like bathing or dressing. Grade 4 events are life-threatening and demand urgent medical intervention to prevent death. Grade 5 indicates the death of the patient, caused directly by the adverse event. This lab-driven data for anemia shows how the scale is applied to decreased hemoglobin levels. A hemoglobin drop reaching 10.0 grams per deciliter triggers an automatic Grade 1 classification. A value between 10.0 and 8.0 grams per deciliter moves the event into Grade 2. Any drop below 8.0 grams per deciliter, where a transfusion is medically indicated, escalates the event to Grade 3. This logic also applies to visual phenotypes. A radiation recall reaction rash is graded by physical progression, moving from faint erythema at Grade 1 to skin necrosis at Grade 4. This criterion-based thresholding removes clinical guesswork. The severity grade is determined by the data points rather than the investigator's opinion. This workflow illustrates how an adverse event is processed from the initial report through to the final risk management plan. First, the symptom must be codified into a standardized MedDRA term to ensure the grading is applied to the correct clinical concept. A critical operational safeguard requires Step 3, severity grading, to remain entirely independent of Step 4, the causation assessment. Reviewers must grade the intensity of an event without considering whether they believe the drug actually caused it. Because adverse events can evolve, worsening symptoms require continuous follow-up to document the escalating grade. Reviewers also account for population-specific needs, such as adjusting the parameters for activities of daily living in pediatric trials. Maintaining this separation is vital. Artificially lowering a severity grade because the drug is not suspected of causality will permanently corrupt the aggregate safety signal. At the macro level, standardized CTCAE data from global trial sites is pooled to form a comprehensive safety database. Medical reviewers rely on this uniformity, ensuring a moderate event at one site carries the exact same clinical weight as another. An unexpected cluster of high-grade events serves as an early warning signal, flagging risks not apparent in smaller populations. When these grades cross specific thresholds, they trigger mandatory protocols, like forced dose reductions or treatment interruptions. Aggravated severity assessment enables predictive risk management, moving beyond the limitations of reactive reporting to identify potential issues before they escalate. The core rule of pharmacovigilance remains: seriousness drives the immediate regulatory response, while severity defines the clinical profile. This rigorously graded data provides the evidence required for mandatory regulatory submissions, such as periodic safety update reports. These reports are what ultimately establish the real-world risk-benefit profile of a pharmaceutical compound. Modern PV professionals maintain this data integrity, ensuring that individual clinical reports contribute to a mathematically sound evidence base. The accuracy of today's severity grading directly informs the safety protocols that will guide clinical practice for years to come.